Good evening and welcome to Peace Week. We are gathered here tonight with clergy of several different beliefs to talk about belief as it relates to action for peace. I'm very glad that you all have joined us, and we will invite you later on in the conversation this evening to jot your questions down so that in the chat so that we can see what questions you might have. If you would like to address them to a particular person, we invite you to say, please address this to the imam or to the rabbi or whomever. But also know that we may just all jump in and answer your question. We're grateful for you all being here tonight, and I would like to introduce my colleagues on the platform. So first, we have Rabbi Beth Cohen, who joins us tonight, and we're very grateful for her wisdom. We also have Imam Arkham Rashid, who is down here from Dover, so we're very grateful for him and his commitment to this conversation this evening. I have my colleague, Reverend Marjorie Belmont Burns, who is a United Methodist pastor from the Lewis Charge, Faith in Israel United Methodist Churches. And we have Father Mark Harris over there on the far left, last and not least, and we welcome you all here tonight. We're very, very grateful for your presence with us. We are going to begin by each of us taking a short time to talk about our own belief, our own faith tradition, and the beliefs that we have, and how that relates to our actions for peace. And then after that, each of us has a chance to share. We will open it up for conversation amongst the participants, as well as for questions from you all. So I have been asked to start, and I am Vicki Gordy-Stith. I am pastor here at Epworth United Methodist Church, and my faith tradition, is a Christian faith tradition from the Wesleyan family. When I think about peace, I think about the one who founded our faith, who is Jesus Christ. I think about his actions and how he gave us really 3 clues for how we are to approach people, approach conflict, and approach our action for peace. The first thing that Jesus gave us when he was on this earth is he gave us hope for change. And he did that primarily through healing, but also through preaching against oppression, preaching for the little people, those who were marginalized, including everyone at his table, and welcoming all. He had a radical hospitality that was a wonderful, wonderful gift. So when I think about Jesus, I think about the hope that he offers us, that things can change. And for me, I have to have hope if I'm going to work for peace. The second thing that I think Jesus gave us was a compassion for everyone, a compassion that moved beyond just accepting people, but wanting what was best for each person, a compassion that looked on people in their heart, not just the way that they appeared, but saw through some of their own fear, some of their own imagery and idolatry, and could see them for who they were. But then Jesus always called people to live their best. And so his compassion extended to that invitation of living their best. And then I think he also had a peace in his heart. And when we have a peace in our heart, it's not that we don't take on conflict. It's not that we avoid conflict. It's that we approach conflict with that peace in our hearts toward other people. Jesus, I think, did this for me most especially when he went to the cross, when he was railing against the oppression of the Romans, against the little people, against the Israelites, over whom they often demanded higher taxes and were very, very brutal at times. He was able to get their attention, and they threatened him. But instead of retaliating, instead of giving in to violence, Jesus instead chose a nonviolent act. And that nonviolent act involved him sacrificing his own life, giving up his own life, saying that he would rather die himself than respond in kind. But it was through his sacrifice and his resurrection that we then began to see that we could live another way, that peace could have another way. And we could get to a place of peace through nonviolent action. And through his death and his resurrection, Jesus changed really the course of our world because he showed us that there was a different way. And I think now when we think, as followers of Jesus, when we think about what he does for us, his Spirit lives in us. So we can offer those same three things. We can offer hope for change. We can offer compassion for all people in calling them to their best. But we can also offer nonviolent resistance. We can offer a way of having a peaceable heart, but still resisting the conflict that we see every day in our lives. And I just wanted to tell you one quick story about how this has played out recently in the life of our church at Epworth. We have a wonderful relationship with the Lewis Charge, and we have done several things with them, including a peace vigil back a couple of months ago, where we prayed together and we marched from Epworth all the way down Route 1 down to Faith Church on Church Street in Rehoboth, and we prayed together, and we had 9 minutes of silence to remember Eric Gardner and how long that he was not able to breathe. And so we have a really good relationship with them. And because of that, we wanted to symbolize our solidarity with them. And so we posted on our sign out front of our church a sign that said, "Enough is enough. Black Lives Matter." And we got a lot of angry calls from people in our community, people who didn't understand why that was important to us, people who felt like we shouldn't be political as a church. And yet for us, this was a sign of solidarity, saying that we care about justice for all people. Well, just this last weekend, that sign was torn down. And not only was it torn down, the rings on the sign and the D-rings and the springs and everything else were broken and taken. And so we started having conversation about how do we approach this act of violence against our church. And we knew that we wanted to do something that would offer hope for change, that would show compassion for the person, but that also would be a nonviolent act of resistance. And I have to tell you that my gut feeling was that we were going to just replace that sign and that I was going to buy 10 of them. And every time someone ripped one down, we were going to put another one back up. But as I started praying about actually this conversation this week, I started thinking about what would be a better response. And so although we haven't fully decided yet, where we have come to as far as our response would be to put up a new sign. And that new sign would say, "Racist actions and tearing down signs cannot silence the call for justice. Stop racism now." And we felt like by recognizing and acknowledging that, yes, you tore our sign down, but also by saying racist actions are not going to silence the voice of the cry of the people, that we could communicate far more about a peaceful heart and what it means to approach conflict with an attitude of peace. So for me, this is how my faith then impacts everyday decisions that I make. So now I would like to turn to Rabbi Beth.
Thank you. So I am actually the Rabbi Emeritus at the Seaside Jewish Community down the street from Epworth. Epworth actually has been our home for at least 15 years for the High Holy Days. So sitting here on this chancel that we call a bima is, it feels like home.
Awesome.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Being here for us, and know that we are also here for you, and be happy to participate in any action that you decide to take in honoring your peaceful action. So, to my colleagues, And to all of you who may be out in Zoom land, I offer the Hebrew greeting, Ma shlomchem, how are you? Or more literally, how's your state of peace? So a little Hebrew lesson. First of all, I used a plural, shlomchem. If I were referring to Father Mark and Imam Arkum, I would say ma shlomcha. And if I were referring to Pastor Marjorie and Pastor Vicky, I would say ma shlomech. And they all come from the Hebrew root word, it's not a root word, shalom. Shalom is often translated as hello, goodbye, and peace. And the Hebrew language is never as simple as it seems to be on the surface. Every Hebrew word comes from a different three-letter root. The word shalom comes from the root shin lamed mem, which is pronounced shalem. Shalem means wholeness, it means complete, and it means perfection. In Hebrew scriptures and other texts, shalom is most commonly used to refer to a state of affairs, one of well-being, tranquility, security, prosperity, circumstances unblemished by any sort of defect. Shalom is a blessing, manifestation of divine grace. Along with truth and justice, shalom, or peace, is considered one of the three key Jewish values. It is a concept that is central to Judaism. So the words we use when we greet one another, ma shlomchem, ma shlomcha, ma shlomech, shows just how important living in a state of peace is in Jewish thinking. According to the Jewish sages, peace is the ultimate purpose of the whole Torah, of all the 5 books. All that is written in the Torah was written for the sake of peace. Judaism describes a special obligation to strive for peace. The tradition commands that people actively pursue peace. We are taught that there are many commandments that require a certain time and place for their performance, but with regard to the mandate to seek peace and pursue it, we are to seek it in our own place and pursue it everywhere else. It is significant that many of the most important Jewish prayers conclude with a supplication for peace. In spite of Judaism's adamant opposition to idolatry, peace is so important that the rabbis taught, "Great is peace, for even if the Jews were to practice idolatry and peace prevailed among them at the same time, God would say, I cannot punish them because peace prevails among them." Yet, there are many sections in Hebrew scriptures which justify war under certain conditions and discuss rules for combat. War was, and is often still, generally accepted as inevitable, and therefore a legitimate foreign policy instrument. God commanded the Israelites to conquer the land of Canaan through warfare and to destroy or evict the inhabitants. The books of Judges and Samuel and Kings report many armed battles, some involving widespread destruction. Although Jewish religious texts frequently deal with war, Judaism does not glorify war for its own sake. The underlying attitude of Jewish tradition is an abhorrence of violence and an affirmation of the obligation to work and make sacrifices for the ultimate goal of peace. Indeed, when war is declared, Hebrew scriptures require that peace be offered prior to commencing an attack. The prophets proclaim that Israel should not depend solely on military arms and alliances, but rather Zion shall be redeemed by justice and her returnees by righteousness, from Isaiah. Peace, shalom, is not only the opposite of war. It is an ideal state. It is perfection, and it is thought that it is something that will not be totally achieved until the Messianic era. And when this time of general societal harmony and perfection comes, we will finally be able to live what the prophet Isaiah teaches in chapter 2, verse 4, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Peace, shalom, between nations, between human beings, between us and our beloveds, is our obligation, our responsibility, our work. It is upon each of us to act, and the action we are commanded to take before we do anything else, Bakesh shalom v'rodfehu, seek peace and pursue it, as we read in Psalms 34:15.
Wonderful, thank you. I was having a couple of questions from people who are on the Zoom link and not on the YouTube link, so I'm trying to switch people over to the YouTube link. Next, we will hear from Reverend Marjorie Belmont Burns.
Hello. That's my test. Hello. Pastor Vicki, it's good to be back here again. I, like so many, entering into the church, the building, but it is good. And I, for me, it's an honor to be a part of this Peace Week, and I have to say, I too was kind of hesitant, didn't want to do it, but here I am. And so when the question for me was how my belief relates to taking action for peace, my belief as it relates to taking action for peace is based on who I am as a Christian. As a young girl, really young, I would read, one of my favorite books to read was the Bible. And at that time, the only version was King James. And so I found it very easy to read the King James Version, but now I find it challenging. But anyway, the Old Testament always fascinated me, yet it was reading the Gospels that truly planted the seed that I was to be my sister and brother's keeper, and that was a lifetime. And for me, when I read the Gospels, my takeaway was that I understood Jesus was the advocate, the pillar for peace. And for me, peace means unity, it means justice for all people, it means being there, advocating for the poor, the marginalized, the hurting, standing in the gap for those who do not have a voice, but standing in the gap and having a non-violent approach to peace. For me, it was Jesus and other imperfect humans being called peace advocates. It means embracing the divine vision of unity, and that means everyone, regardless of your race, your culture, your economic class, having a place at the table, everyone being treated with respect and with dignity. And yet the call to be an advocate for peace, it does take courage. It takes courage to embrace that call, because it will mean at times you're going to have to stand alone. You will have to, it's going against the status quo of the day. It's being called everything but a child of God, being misunderstood, refusing to go along to get along, refusing to compromise your belief that everyone has a right to be treated equally and justly. For me, the call to be an advocate for peace comes with the understanding that there's no room for self-glorification. There's no room, as I say, for pat, claps, and taps. There's no room for monetary gain. There's no room for fame, because you are embracing the call with the belief that it is bigger than self. And so as I reflect on my life as an African American growing up in this county, Sussex County, there's no question in my mind that, and I'm going to say, when God was forming me in my mother's womb, he was also delicately orchestrating, choreographing me to be one of a peace advocate. Because as a little girl, I can recall watching on the black and white television peaceful protests and rallies and marches being held, primarily in the South. I can recall reading black and whites walking together, marching together, holding hands together, singing together, protesting for the right for blacks to vote, the right for blacks to have fair housing, equal housing, fair wages, and dismantling segregation. But what always was stuck in my mind was this: seeing them being peaceful, walking together in unity, yet being beaten, being hosed, water hosed. Hearing about George Wallace at that time being passionate, adamant, of having this strong desire to keep blacks in their place, caused me to ask why. And it wasn't that I was asking a particular person why, it was more me asking God why. Why would people or someone hate another person because of the color of their skin? Why would even Christians hate people because of the color of their skin? Why would they justify using the Bible to justify slavery, to justify blacks being less than? And so I struggled. My struggle at that time was with the militant actions and beliefs of Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and Angela Davis, because all I heard was that nonviolent actions change nothing. Change only comes through aggressive actions, aggressive movements. And so as a young lady, I saw Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and Angela Davis and others basically having the same message, yet being divided in their belief as to how the message of peace should be communicated. I struggled between the nonviolent methods and the highly aggressive methods, or the militant methods. And I confess, there was times growing up, I said, yes, I'm gonna be a Black Panther, and I had the frown, I'm gonna be an Angela Davis, and you know, and then it was like, no, these are my emotions getting ahead of me, because as a Christian young lady, if I was going to stand in the gap for those whose voice was silent, then I had to carry out my actions, peaceful actions, in a way that would glorify Christ. And so as I look back over my childhood, there are various moments that I, as a teenager, stood with others for justice. I remember I was shaking in my boots when I got a petition together in my junior high school, and we had a sit-in because administrators at that time were not listening to the blacks who were there. Were not listening to us when we said we're being called the N-word. Many of us could not even go into the bathroom because there were crowds around saying, no, you can't come in here. Teachers were overlooking us. We were raising our hand, teachers were overlooking us. And so for me, it was, how can we get the attention, how can we change this system in a nonviolent way? So it was like during my childhood and my young adult life, I wasn't aware that my nonviolent actions have a label, and that label is passive resistance. Because in my opinion, Jesus was a passive, resistant advocate for peace. His approach was through nonviolent actions. In many instances, his message was violence causes more violence. It causes those whom you are trying to reach, it trying to change that system to just shut down. And it even discounts the vision that you have been given. And so for me, Jesus in his past and his present, future, passive, resistant, peace advocates, we understand and understood that peace is achievable through nonviolent actions and nonviolent methods. So I fast forward. 1990, I answered the call to ministry. 1991, I come in to the United Methodist Church. And I have to say, I was very naive. I was very looking at life through rose-colored glasses. And let me explain that. Because I believe that every clergy person took a stand against injustices on every level. I really, really did. And I believe that they would stand, all of us would stand in the gap for all persons, especially the disadvantaged and the least of our brothers and sisters. But my wake-up moment to reality came when the United Methodist Church and started the initiative. Now, I think it was Mission and Ministry Initiative, or it was Mission and Ministry, that much I do know. And so from my perspective, this initiative was to bring the white clergy and congregations together to reach across lines, to pool our resources together, to basically to show in our communities a little taste of heaven on earth, what heaven is supposed to look like. And so I was in a cluster with, I think it was 6 other clergy, white males, and I was the only black and the only woman. But I didn't feel intimidated, didn't feel threatened, because from a business perspective, I had, always been around, white males, so that was the thing. So we agreed, and if I'm not mistaken, one of Tony Evans' book, he had a book, and I think the book is Let's Get to Know Each Other. And so we agreed to do that study. We met for weeks and weeks and weeks and talked about race and how we could, go over the boundaries and whatnot, bring down the walls and all of this kind of stuff. And I thought that we were making it, amongst the clergy, a great impact. But one night, I got slapped into reality. One of my colleagues, male colleagues, offered to give me a ride back to the parsonage, and as we were talking, he said, Marjorie, I need to tell you this. I really did not and do not believe in the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I believe that he caused more disunity than unity. I believe that, he said, blacks, if he had left things alone, blacks would eventually rise up. Now, anyone who knows me would ask, what word did you use? And I was really nice. I didn't use any, ungodly words. But my first response to him was, do you understand you're talking to a black woman? And to make a remark, that's your opinion, but to make a remark like that is almost slapping me in my face. And the entire time, so for me, you're phony. You are a phony, because you have been sitting in these sessions with us where we talk about race and talk about how we can break down the wall, and you tell me something like this. Thank you for your opinion. And I did tell him, I give you permission not to ever speak to me again. But I had to ask God, forgive me. Anyway, move on forward. So later that night, I came to the painful realization that racism, peace, was embedded in the church more than it was in any other organization. And so for me that night, I also decided to fully embrace my call to ministry. but also the call to be a positive, resistant advocate for peace. And then, and especially now during these chaotic, turbulent times that we are facing, I understand that God has given me a voice to be the voice for those whose voice fall on unresponsive, uncaring, and insensitive ears and hearts. And I have to say, I don't get it right all the time. Many times I put my foot in my mouth. Yet, I do teach and I do preach and I do model passive, resistant actions for peace, not only to the congregations that I serve, but also to my family, to my friends, and even to strangers. I am a prayer warrior. I am a prayer warrior. And every morning, when I open my eyes, I can open my eyes at 2 o'clock in the morning, I still say it. I can open it again at 5 o'clock, I still say it. I ask God to suit me up with the full armor of God. And as he is suiting me up with the full armor of God, that I have a deeper connection with him, that be a part of the armor, because more than ever, I must be a passive, resistant advocate for peace. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you very much. So, Imam, would you like to share with us from your faith tradition?
I want to begin by praising God and sending peace and blessings upon the last and final messenger in the Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And after, I want to welcome all of you that are watching this from home or that are going to watch this recorded to this session. And I want to thank this church for hosting us here and my co-panelists for joining me here on the stage today. It's been a wonderful discussion so far, or if you want to call it a discussion. And there's no way that I can top personal experiences that you spoke about, those stories and that entire segment that you went through in your early life and that transition, that was so touching and so powerful. Thank you. So I want to kind of begin similar to what the rabbi did here, and as the rabbi was speaking, I was actually thinking that almost every sentence that she spoke, you can replace in the Jewish tradition with Islamic tradition. Just swap it out. From the very beginning, from the old linguistic breakdown as well. As many people know, the name of our faith is Islam. And the root word of Islam comes from the word salama, which means peace in Arabic. And I'm going to go on the same lines as the rabbi did. Islam itself as a word, right? The name of the religion doesn't mean peace. The name of the religion means submission. So Islam means submission. The word salam, which sounds very similar to Islam, means peace, because they both extend from that root word, which is salama, peace. And the idea behind it is that we believe a person is only able to attain true peace through submission to God. That the true method, or the only method of attaining true peace, you can have temporary peace in this world, right? If somebody gave me $1 million, I'd probably have temporary peace, for the time being. But true peace, as we believe in the Islamic faith, is only attained through that method of submission to God. And we believe that this is the method, or this is the purpose, this attaining this true peace. From the Islamic perspective, this is the purpose of every single message that was sent before. So we believe that the great prophet Moses, for us, was sent with the same message, that it's to attain this true peace. And for us, we believe that Prophet Jesus was sent with the same message as well, that to attain that true peace through submission. Now, the Islamic word, as we said, for peace was salam, and this is something that Muslims greet each other with as well. As the rabbi was explaining the different greetings, similarly we have the greeting assalamu alaikum, which means may peace be upon you. And it's the Muslim way of saying hello, right? So whenever we greet each other, we say assalamu alaikum, may peace be upon you, and then you respond by saying wa alaikum assalam, and may peace be upon you as well. So the idea, the concepts that the religion lies on that it's founded on is this idea of attaining peace. It's this idea of wishing peace upon other people as well. And one of the greatest examples for us in the Islamic tradition is to follow the example and the lifestyle and the method of the Prophet Muhammad, who we believe is the last and final messenger. And the Prophet Muhammad, throughout his life, he exemplified and he acted upon certain things that I'll explain in just a second, but certain things that he implemented to attain peace. And whether that be peace in terms of a spiritual connection with God, or whether that be peace in terms of the relationship with other individuals around you. And one of the methods of attaining this peace, because the idea today is to kind of discuss groundwork, kind of discuss how we can attain this peace between individuals, is to look out for those that are struggling, to look out for those that are suffering in society, who might not have the same abilities and the same opportunities as somebody else. This kind of brings me to a tradition that I want to share, which is the Prophet Muhammad. In Arabic, I'll share it first and then I'll translate it to English. The Prophet Muhammad, he says, مَنْ رَأَى مِنْكُمْ مُنْكَرْ فَلْيُغَيِّرْهُ بِيَدِهِ فإن لم يستطع فبلسانه فإن لم يستطع فبقلبه وذلك أضعف الإيمان. In this tradition that I recited in Arabic, the Prophet Muhammad, he says that whoever sees an evil, right, whoever witnesses an evil, a wrongdoing, something that is wrong, something that is unjust, whoever sees that and witnesses that, then let that person bring about a physical change to that. So the scholars of the tradition, they actually comment on this and they say that people who are able to implement change, and in our society we do that through policies, we do that through implementing policies, voting in policies, we do that through holding those that are in charge accountable, right? So that's the first and foremost method of attaining that peace, of attaining that true peace, that you remove evil. The tradition continues and it says that فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ, if that person is not capable of doing so, then let that person bring about that change or change that evil by speaking about it. But you can only move on to speaking about it if you can't achieve the first method, right? It says that if you're not able to, then let that person speak about it. A lot of times we jump to the second method and say, you know what, I don't need to put in the effort to bring about that change. I don't need to put in the effort to remove that evil or remove that wrongdoing. Rather, I can just speak about it. I can write about it on Instagram. I can post about it on Instagram. I can write a status on Facebook, get a couple of likes, and that'll be it, right? But you're not supposed to move to that second part or that second step until you exhaust your resources within that first step. The third and final step, he says, is that فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ, if that person is not even able to speak out about it, speak against it, right? Then فَبِقَلْبِهِ, then at least let that person truly feel something in their heart. Now this is where it gets dangerous, because if we see injustice, if we see somebody being wronged, and we don't feel anything, or we feel indifferent about it, right? And the Prophet Muhammad ends this by saying, وَذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ, that's the lowest level of faith. If you don't even have that, then this tradition is saying that you're below the lowest level of faith. If you can't feel, if you can't empathize with somebody in terms of the struggles that they're going through. Now, I want to share an example, and I end with this example. This is one of the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad where he states that let a city dweller not sell to the Bedouin. And I'm going to explain why this is relevant. Right, so in this tradition he says let somebody that's living in the city, a resident of the city, not sell to the Bedouin. During that time, what would happen is that the people of the city, they would wait around the borders of the city. And as the Bedouin comes to the marketplace to purchase something, they would be standing right at the entrance of the city and they would sell that product for a lot higher than the actual prices in the marketplace. And this would be because the Bedouins didn't know the prices in the market at the time. They're coming in for a certain product, they see it, this guy sells it to them, like, all right, good to go. right? So the Prophet Muhammad makes this statement. But in reality, what this is, it's a policy that's being implemented. He's saying that there are individuals that are being taken advantage of, and you don't have the right to take advantage of them. And not only is he stating that, but it becomes part of Islamic law that it's not permissible for people in the city to take advantage of those that are living outside of the city, right? In terms of they're not understanding the prices or whatever it may be. But ideas like this and policies like this is what we need to relate in our own day and age, right? Here in Delaware, here in the city of Rehoboth, or the city of Newark, or the city of Dover, what policy changes can we bring into play that the people who are struggling, the people that are facing all different types of injustices, right? What will uplift them? And what changes can we make to bring about that peace in their lives? So I hope that we are able to actually not just talk about this, but bring it into action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to close with Father Mark, if you would like to share your remarks, and then we will open it up for conversation.
Okay. Well, I couldn't help noticing that I got to be last in the pecking order, which is appropriate and embarrassing all at the same time. I'm, at least as far as I can figure out, the only representative of the ruling class here. That is to say, until probably the middle of the 20th century, only people who looked like me would be on this stage talking. The number of women clergy, the possibility of imam being in a group and a stage in America talking about religious issues was pretty low. Women rabbis, not so much. Something happened in the course of the last 75 years or so that significantly changed the atmosphere. So I want to say a couple of words out of, let us say, a very mixed report then. And where I want to start is, yesterday was the day that is traditionally set apart to celebrate St. Francis. But because it's a Sunday, actually, you end up having to transfer it over to today. So this is really sort of the next available day to celebrate St. Francis. And that's appropriate, it seems to me, as a place to begin. He had a prayer that begins, "Lord, make us instruments of your peace." And while he's often seen as a peace saint, he actually embodies the full paradoxical stance of Christianity as it relates to actions for peace. And that's because when he was a young man, he bore arms and served in military service, and was something of a rabble-rouser and a revelry sort of person. And he contributed and lived off the social inequities of the time. But later as a monastic, he remained as well fully obedient to the established religion in the West, the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, this was during the time of the Crusades. This was in the time of the Crusades, and there were promises, if you were heretical, that you would be tried and executed. And generally, it was a time that was antithetical to any radical peace activism. And there's little to suggest that Francis was actually a peace activist. He was an instrument of peace. That's quite different. He was willing to serve peace, but he wasn't out there pressing to make sure that there was no more war. it would remain for others to be activists at a later time. My sense is that Christian peace activism, or action for peace, is a product of our time, just as most of the changes that make it possible for us to all be here on this stage are a product of our time. The few hints, at least in the Christian tradition, of earlier peace activism is to be found among dissenter Christians, principally Mennonites and other Anabaptists, who in the 16th century said that you could only be a believer as an adult who understood precisely why you were going to be a believer. And for them, the Sermon on the Mount was absolutely core. And of course, the Sermon on the Mount talks about loving your enemies. No if, ands, or buts. It's just there. And so they suggested that if you were a believer and took this seriously, you had to be committed to being a pacifist. Not a peacemaker, but a pacifist. That is to say, you had to begin with action, right? If you believed it, act. You could talk about it too, but you had to act. So that really lingered as a possibility there, but people like me in previous generations, clergy of the church, were not particularly disposed to pacifist or even peace action. Well, there it is. When I think about my own faith development, I'm informed by the faith of the church, the Christian faith, and more explicitly by the faith as it's expressed in the Episcopal Church. But the source of my faith really derives from a much wider set of spiritual experiences, which did not match up very well with this. When I was a teenager, early teenager, I must have been maybe 13, took a history course on world history, and I heard what we did in the Crusades, and I stopped going to church. I was appalled, as only a righteous 13-year-old can be. I was seriously appalled. What brought me back into the church was another teenage activity, which is called unrequited love. And in my disappointment about not even knowing what to do with my emotions, I rediscovered the Psalms, which I had known earlier as a child, but now came back to me as a source of consolation and a source of peace at a time of internal kind of emotional violence. I see some nodding of heads. Occasionally this must strike the rest of you. So I guess what I want to say today really echoes a little bit, not so much my religious belief as my spiritual belief. As to say, from a spiritual standpoint, I come out at a very different place than the history of my church would suggest, or the history of most churches that were in any way established, or for that matter, most religions that are in any form established. Established religions begin to confuse civic virtues with spiritual virtues, and they get quite confused. I think I do buy very much into the Anabaptist understanding that as a believer, I have to take seriously that Jesus came preaching not only the love of our enemies, but the end of systemic means by which we become enemies, by which we make enmity, by which we decide that there are the people who are in or in charge, and then there's the rest of those four Slavs who are outside, right? And overcoming that turns out to be a core piece of what I understand the message of Jesus Christ to be about. And for that matter, as you have said, sir, I think very much what is at the core of the kind of search for peace that you find from those people we're willing to follow in this world, those people who we consider prophetic. So that's all to that side. I have to say, I don't believe that Jesus was into avoidance or thought that the work was going to be easy. He recognized that what he would say would set people in conflict with one another. Peace as the absence of conflict was not what he advocated, because I believe he did not come preaching peace with oppression. I believe he advocated for peace being accompanied by God's justice. God's justice and mercy together seem to be at the core. We Christians are given sometimes to saying that in Jesus we see all the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And because we experience that fulfillment now in the presence of Jesus, known spiritually, as well as at the final day, I believe in some strange way that in Jesus I find peace in my heart and contentment, even as I find myself very restless with the injustices in the world. So others will find other doors for peace. I think that one turns out to be mine. You all have spoken, I think, quite importantly to the notion that the matter of fulfilling the law and the prophets turns out to be recognized primarily in a very inclusive way. That is to say, not only inclusive of various traditions, but also inclusive of people with all sorts of different experiences. So I tend to look for pointers wherever I can find them. And I need all the help I can get, right? So I look everywhere I can for the pointers that would bring me to peace. So my beliefs about action for peace are that to the extent that they are informed for me by Jesus are that we must love our enemies, we must stand up to those structures that reduce others to enemies or that make us instruments of oppression, and we have to consider this peace work to be the way that we walk with God. Now, having said that, I have to also recognize that for the largest part of the Christian history, that has not been the way the churches have acted. The churches have been, as I suggested earlier, perfectly willing to make their peace with the oppressors. It's hard to have an established church and not have that happen. The Episcopal Church, at least in England, was the established church, and in the United States, up until fairly recently, kind of thought of itself as pretty much the established church here. And I have to say that for a large period of that time, we made our peace with oppression. I think what has changed the whole matter, at least for my church, were three things. The first was the growing realization in world wars that the matter of being a conscientious objector was first an allowable Christian position to take, and as time went on, an increasingly important one for people to take. So the Episcopal Church, beginning between the two wars, and finally for sure at the beginning of the Second World War, openly talked about the option for its members to be conscientious objectors. This was huge and ticked off a fairly large number of Episcopalians, not to mention the rest of the establishment. The second one was, when we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, the rules changed. And one of the rules was, if you're not going to have, in the ordinary sense, world wars, why don't you just have eternal war? You'll have war all the time. So instead of having one big one, we'll have lots and lots of small ones. And we'll essentially wear everybody else out over the course of a long period of time, which means that the oppression that is horrible during the course of war now becomes a constant oppression of peoples all over the world. And I believe, at least in the Episcopal Church, the peace movement in the Episcopal Church really began with the realization that not only was war with atomic weapons to be made impossible, but the war that we replaced it with, which was the eternal war of the haves against the have-nots, had to come to an end. That peacemaking now involved dealing with the injustices by which the oppressors oppress. And those injustices now include a whole variety of other things besides war making. Turns out economic warfare is warfare. It turns out that sexual warfare is warfare, right? I mean, all the means by which oppression takes place become part of the same scheme. So I believe what's happening, at least in the Episcopal Church, is we are becoming a peacemaking church at this point. That is to say, we recognize that it is the place that we have been willing to be in as acquiescing to oppression. That is itself oppressing, and therefore we have to change that. At least a fair number of us are becoming pacifists. That's still shaky. There's a fair number of us who are not pacifists. I'm better at it than you used to be. I mean, I have to work at being a pacifist, particularly on a really bad day, right? But there's a movement that's going on, it seems to me, in which the echo that I have of the Jesus that I remember, that calls me to love my enemies, is now the same Jesus who calls me to see all the forms of injustice that are there as being as onerous and as needing to be overcome. And so I see part of my job, part of my action for peace, as being an internal activity as well as an external one. To make peace then becomes an inner spiritual struggle as well as an exterior struggle with the forces of oppression in the world. That's it.
Thank you very much. Your last comments reminded me of the United Methodist membership vows, which ask people, will you resist evil and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? And I think, we all answer yes to that, but how well we actually live that out is an ongoing struggle. And I think that's part of what I've heard tonight, is that peace is a lifetime journey. It's not just something that we do once. It's not just one action. And so we don't have any questions yet from our viewers, but wanted to see if you all had comments or responses to each other and your remarks.
I do. Marjorie, I am so glad that you presented the view of the same message coming from people who viewed different ways of getting to that message and delivering it. Because when I was asked to be on this panel, I looked at the words that drove it in terms of belief. Belief as it relates to action for peace. And I really got stuck on the word belief, because belief can really be both a positive in many eyes and a negative in many eyes, and vice versa on both sides of, or all of the spectrum. So when you brought that up in terms of your own experience of hearing the same message, but two different ways to carry out that message, I think that that's something that we as faith communities have trouble dealing with. And I think that it's very present for us. And so I am so glad that that was part of your message, because I think it's so hard to deal with beliefs, because beliefs are really, I think, what we learn, what we're taught, what we perhaps experience, and it doesn't get to our feelings.
No, it doesn't.
And I think that when we're talking about peace, that feelings are where we have to go, and we have to ask people, why do you feel the way you do?
I agree. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's interesting, I'm trying to think of who it was who wrote it. Phyllis Tickle, I believe, talked about how in the church currently we have shifted our way of understanding how we come to identify ourselves as part of that community. And she said that initially, a long time ago, it used to be that you had to start with right beliefs, and then you went to right behavior, and then you could get a sense of belonging. But she said actually now that whole process has shifted, where people want to get a sense of belonging first, and then once they're a part of a community that practices a certain way and they feel like they belong, then they begin to adapt the behaviors of that community, and that ultimately leads to belief. And I sometimes wonder if we approach our faith communities in that second way of belonging first and then the behavior coming out of that belonging and then getting to our beliefs, that our beliefs might not clash as much as they do when we start with belief and then we push the behaviors from there. So that was very fascinating. Thank you, Rabbi.
Between action and words and the twinge of the heart. I mean, you know, that the most important is to act for peace. If you can't quite do that, then speak for peace. But for goodness sakes, at least have a longing for peace. I mean, you know, if you don't have a longing for peace at all, then you kind of fall off the spectrum entirely. So part of what that triggered in my mind was, there seem to be people who are tone deaf to the possibility of peace. I mean, it's just not, you know, it doesn't seem to compute. For them, the encouragement to work for peace is asking too much. You have to get them in the door just a little bit. You have to pull on some empathetic hook of some sort that gets them into the conversation. And it seems to me that small acts of loving kindness probably are what those hooks are about. And I mean hooks in the right sense. I don't mean in the sense of how you hook them in to become whatever you are. I mean to hook them into having a real active life for peace, right? And the bet is that with people with whom we are in, either for social reasons or personal reasons, in enmity with, we're not relating with them at all, right? If somebody can jump that barrier just enough to care at all for them, to have a sense of loving kindness for them at all, then you can begin to talk then about how you overcome injustice with justice, or violence with peace. But that's very hard to do, as you know.
And then there's the definition of peace. Because I think that there isn't a universal definition, although we would like to think that there is. One person's journey to peace may be very different. Not the journey, but even the end result may be very different than someone else's. And so I really wonder, how do we get to a place where we can have a universal understanding of loving kindness, of touching the heart, because I think that I'm not sure that we ever can, but it concerns me that the struggle, that we struggle sometimes for the same thing, even going back to Marjorie, to your example of the Martin Luther King versus the Malcolm X's and the Angela Davis's. I worry. I don't so much worry. I've really gotten to the point where I got old enough that life is kind of where it's going to be, and I'm going to continue on my spiritual path and hopefully open my heart as much as I can. Yet I think about differences of opinion and getting to similarities and getting to places where we can agree on things, even though there may be places where we disagree violently on things. And I worry that we're not doing enough to get there. And so peace is kind of like an end result. And what really is that? Frankly, I think it really is all about the journey.
I think, if you're done, as you were speaking, actually, it kind of sparked a tradition that's in the Islamic faith, but it's also in the Christian faith, and it's also in the Jewish faith as well. And in the Islamic faith, it's a tradition of the Prophet Muhammad where he says that none of you will be true believers until you're able to love for your brothers and sisters what you love for yourself. So that's the version that's in the Islamic faith. And as you were speaking about how there's no universal definition of what peace is, but there is an individual definition of what you want peace to be and what you want to attain. So I think when you apply that tradition of wanting for others what you want for yourself, right? Nobody wants injustice for themselves. Nobody wants hardship and suffering and pain and this and that. That's considered evil for themselves. But if you're able to want all the good things that you want for yourself for others, I think even if your definitions of peace differ with people, that application of wanting good will apply.
That's a great point. And you, my brother, when you were talking earlier, I thought about something that I wrote, and I didn't read.
Sam, our actions must match our words and action. Because a few years ago, many years ago, I got to the point in which I would listen to people, talk about, peace and justice for all and whatnot. And it was, for many, it was just talk. It was talk, and the action was not behind it. I read Dr. Martin Luther King's book, and this brought it out. I read his little book, The Letter from the Birmingham Jail. I think it's 35, 39 pages. And what struck me is that those local clergy wanted Dr. King to stay out of their city, and that he was basically causing more chaos. But here was Birmingham, the most segregated city at that time in our country. Churches were being bombed, people were being lynched, all types of injustices were being pounced on the blacks there, but local clergy telling Dr. King, you need to stay out of here and let the courts decide how justice should be served. When, dismantling segregation, when the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, had already said, segregation is a no-no. But what struck me is that, and I tried not to sit in the seat of judgment, and yet, what are they preaching on Sunday morning to their congregation? If here is a person who's nonviolent, saying, we're tired of waiting, blah, 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 and we're asking the clergy in this community to back us up. I mean, you're preaching the gospel, justice for all. Jesus is supposed to be your role model. So you're saying that we should just let everything go, let injustices, parade on. So I come back to action. Our words and our actions must line up and I can only speak for the African American community, because we've heard a lot of words and the actions were entirely different. And I'm not saying from the outside, I'm saying right from the pulpit. Right from the pulpit. And so for me, I believe that this is the time, in this chaotic time that we're living in, this is the time for the church to say our words, whom we believe in, and our actions are going to come together. Now, we can't, peace is different, our methods, but nonviolent is the way to go. And so we're going to link arms together, and we're going to sit down and talk, and how can we overcome, it may be only this little section, but overcome the injustices that are in our community. We'll start here and then go out. But thank you.
So we still don't have any questions from our viewers. I'm still looking. But I will pose one to you all. How do we, as people who follow and practice faith beliefs, influence the polarity that we see in our nation today? It's easy to think we have peace when you unfriend everyone on Facebook who doesn't agree with you, but that doesn't really lead to peace. And yet, do you engage with every single person who, spouts off rhetoric that is harmful, that you wouldn't want spoken against yourself? So what is our role as faith communities? And And I guess I'm partly vamping off the fact that, people labeled the Black Lives Matter sign as being political, and that churches shouldn't be political. And I don't know with Jewish faith and Islam if you get the same kind of pushback that your congregations and your communion or your communities shouldn't be political. But how do we as communities of faith engage in that conversation today so that we can have a positive impact on the direction that we're going? An easy question.
So, in the Jewish world today, the conversation has been around for a long time, yet it's been rising about anti-Semitism because of the rise of white supremacist groups. So in some respects, like Black Lives Matter, we don't necessarily have that kind of movement, yet it's the same kind of issue. Jews have been persecuted throughout our history. We, thank goodness, keep bouncing back. So, we think about, will we come in tomorrow morning to see the building with a swastika on it? It is a conscious and a consistent issue. We're, always looking over our shoulder. I think that one of the things that perhaps we need to do, and I want to go along with Marjorie's comment about nonviolent activity, that perhaps we are not, as I see it, very active in this community in terms of nonviolent activity as a faith community. We use a lot of words. There is not, from what I can see, and maybe I just haven't been seeing it, but there is not a lot of community action. There are individual houses of faith, which will do things within their group. Maybe it's time for us as a community to get together and do some kind of nonviolent action. Seaside participated in the Unity vigil that Epworth and Faith United did. We did not have a lot of people there. However, those who came felt like it was an important thing to do. St. Peter's has been very involved, I don't know if you're still doing it, but in the vigil that was in front of the Zwanendel Museum every Sunday. And a lot of people from the community came and participated in that. I don't think that we have, though, an organized nonviolent action group to kind of say, okay, here's what's coming up, here's kind of what we need to do. So maybe that's something that I'm not exactly sure how, and I'm not willing to raise my hand. Yet I think we need something like that.
And perhaps that is part of our call from our conversation tonight. So.
I know that for Bridging the Divide, that's the ministry between Faith Israel and Epworth. If I'm not mistaken, it's 3 years. I think we're 3 years. And so it is multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-racial. And our goal for Bridging the Divide is to break down the walls, the racial walls that separate us. I thought we were fairly active until COVID showed up. We started off with something which was very daring, to view the documentary 13. And from there, we talked about the new Jim Crow. We did the study on that. And there were about 25, 30 participants between the three churches. We've had other activities, revisiting Rosedale. Rosedale was right there in Millsboro. And Rosedale used to be the 50s, 60s, 70s, the place where African Americans, partied. All top entertainers came to Rosedale. You had the Temptations, and that whole group of folk would show up, and because that was one of two places where blacks could go. It's on the water, and that's the thing. It was on the water. And so we had, it's a group now that sings the songs, from those top entertainers. So we had that here. It was a dinner, and we had 125 to attend from the community, and had a little waiting list. We have had discussions. We've had a retreat, and we were going to, on, I think it was Good Friday, we were going to have a healing service for blacks and whites, a healing, where the hurt has been, We had also planned, we did a study on the LBGT from the biblical perspective. So my point is we have tried, and we still are, trying to bring down the wall. And for me is if, I think we need to be more visible. Yeah, I agree with you. We need to be, Rabbi, we need to be more visible. Yet, I come with the understanding, if there's only 2 or 3 that show up, we can still make an impact, because there are 2 or 3, then 3 more tell, and it grows, but it's also a time where, the racial divide across the injustice and whatever, on all different types of levels, is so embedded in our country that we're almost afraid to say anything. Because I don't want to offend you, you don't want to offend me, and blah, blah, blah. But I honestly believe that if we have the small groups, and with given the quote unquote permission to express how you're feeling, and also to agree to disagree. I honestly did not expect any of y'all to fully understand my journey. It's impossible. But I do believe that as I can have empathy for all of you, you can have empathy for me. And that's a start. That is a start.
And I would be remiss, and I'm sure that the people from Seaside who are watching this saying, Beth, what are you talking about? Because this group here that's sitting up here is here because there is an effort of a group of faith houses to try to be together, to understand each other, to learn who we are, and so I know that that's an ongoing effort and has been ongoing for quite some time. Again, I think I agree with you though about the visibility. It's like even within our own congregations, I have a feeling that they don't, even though we've probably told them 12 times, they don't know that this communal exercise together is actually happening, and what it means and how it's working. So yes, I think we have, and maybe you're right, maybe we can only do it in very small pieces, and hope that we will make an inroad. I guess I'm looking for something big.
It's possible. It's possible.
I would like to raise a question moving forward, which is, I think that the next wars are going to be driven by what will become larger and larger migrations of peoples, primarily because of climate change. It'll seem like it's a matter of what nations are doing with each other and policies and, you know, administrations of one sort or another, but the movements of people to places that are tolerable for living, and the already huge inequities over who gets the world's properties that seem to be habitable, it's already in play. And it's likely to get worse rather rapidly. And the combination of climate change, where the energies are to be found, who gets that energy, those kinds of things, are going to, I think, give rise to the kinds of wars of acquisition that used to be about just acquiring more land, more peoples, whatever. But people are going to want the good land, the stuff that's left, the stuff that hasn't been destroyed in one way or another by us. It's a fairly dark, gloomy, apocalyptic kind of vision, but I can't help but think that when we talk about issues of peace, that one of the things we need to figure out how to address is the sort of brand loyalties around which more and more of us will coalesce. White supremacy is one aspect of that. Those people who feel beleaguered by feeling that what power they had, which wasn't much to start off with, is now encroached on, will get more and more violent about it. That's sort of what's happening, it seems to me, with white supremacy these days. But that's only the surface. I mean, I thought for a while it was going to be the oil wars that was going to be the next thing around the block, but apparently we seem to be moving on a little bit from absolute total lust for oil, but there's going to be a lust for land. There's going to be a lust for habitable places to be, and I'm really the situation for people of color in America is likely to get worse, not better, because the available resources and the money and the power will all continue to will all continue to reside with an increasingly smaller number of people in the United States, and they will be mostly white, and they will mostly be rich. And I think there's going to be profound problems about peace, whose ripple effects are going to be seen all over the world in a whole variety of ways. I think people of faith, it seems to me, to follow up on Rabbi's good thoughts on this, need to organize like crazy against the onslaught of, I think, more and more violent social behavior that's going to happen. And I absolutely agree that one of the core characteristics of that preparation is going to be understanding what nonviolence is about. That nonviolence is not acquiescence or unwillingness to confront, but that the confrontation itself is nonviolent. If we don't do that, what will happen is, if we don't train those who come to the possibility of nonviolent resistance, what comes will come with violent resistance. And that way lies a kind of madness that I don't think any of our faith traditions really saw as part of whatever we thought peace was, or paradise, or heaven, or contentment, right? That'll all be part of strife, and that's just, I think, the big one we've got to work against.
So we have come to the end of our time, but we have time for one more comment. Were you going to say something, Amon?
We can conclude. I mean, I was just going to kind of continue on the conversation if we were going on, but it's fine. We can conclude.
I hope that part of what we've heard and shared with one another is the importance of doing this work in community and letting people know what we're doing, so that as we continue to take action for peace, it's not just something we're doing to ourselves and keeping under the, umbrella, but we're spreading that word around and helping people see, so that I agree with Father Mark, as the world continues to grapple for less resources, we want to be able to make sure that we care for each other, and then that can be a part of caring for our world. Are there any final comments? And then we'll sign off. It's 8:30 right now, but we have time for a final comment if someone would like to reflect.
Thank you to the group that put this together.
Well, thank you to you all. I do think this is an awesome gift that we have, to be able to have these conversations. And I hope that those who were viewing tonight were able to see possibilities for peace and what that might look like as we continue to work. And I hope that this is an invitation to continue the work of peace and not to simply allow it to be something that we do once a year during Peace Week, but that it becomes a life of peace. Good night.